Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm John Lenchowski, president of the Institute, and this is a particularly delicious moment for me to have one of our graduates, Caitlin Schindler, to come and give this talk. Caitlin studied here several years ago, got her master's degree in strategic intelligence, and she's also had some experience working in that field, supporting the intelligence community, working at CACI. In the last several years, she has been studying and just recently completed her PhD at the University of Leeds in England, and is going to be talking about her dissertation. And she studied under Simon Popple and Nicholas Cull, who, of course, Professor Cull is at the Center for Public Diplomacy at the University of Southern California and teaches there. And so I couldn't be more delighted that one of our students has gone into very in-depth study in one of the fields which we consider to be a matter of really strategic importance here at IWP. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Caitlin.
So, good afternoon, and thank you all for coming. As any PhD student or researcher will tell you, they're thrilled when they have a willing audience to listen to their research. Their eyes light up. So I'll do my best to make this entertaining and relevant to you all. And I look forward to any questions, comments, or criticism. I have been out of the business for 4 years, and I have been overseas, so I may have gone a little native. Please don't hold it against me. So just to give you a background, I'm going to be kind of sharing with you a portion of my research, and my research asked the question, what is the role of public diplomacy in statecraft? What is its niche? Because in studying here at the Institute and in working in the IC, it occurred to me that we really have not defined that, and that is really a struggle that we're facing right now in the use of public diplomacy. You can talk about the bureaucratic issues and all the other issues facing it that are often in the press and in IG reports, but really, where does it fit? And I wanted to look at it from a historical perspective because, again, studying it here at the Institute, I was exposed to how our American founding fathers used public diplomacy and propaganda regularly as a part of their statecraft in trying to gain our independence as an independent nation. So I wanted to look at U.S. public diplomacy in the context of its history and political culture within the U.S. Slide. And in order to do this, I had to do a couple of things so that historians and public diplomacy people wouldn't cringe. First of all, I used the term foreign public engagement instead of public diplomacy. So you're going to hear me saying foreign public engagement, not public diplomacy, although I may use them interchangeably. And I did this for a number of reasons. Public diplomacy is a relatively contested term, and we'll get into that later in this presentation. Also, the term itself didn't really exist in the context we understand it today until 1962. So I define foreign public engagement as any conscious effort by either the U.S. government or private entities to interact or communicate with people of foreign nations beyond superficial relationships such as trade and administrative correspondences. And then coupled with that kind of general understanding of what foreign public engagement was, I used Nicholas Cull's core practices of public diplomacy, which he identifies as going back historically before the term existed and are universal around the world. They're not unique to the United States. And he identifies these as listening, advocacy, international broadcasting, educational exchange, cultural exchange, and psychological warfare. And as it turns out, at least 4 of these core practices are actually identified in the Smith-Mundt Act, and that would be advocacy, international broadcasting, and the 2 different types of exchange. Okay, slide please. So the title of this presentation is New Century, Same Problems. Well, what are those problems? Some of us in this room who maybe either work in government or pay attention to the news, they're interested in public diplomacy. We may already have some ideas about what those problems are, but just for we're all on the same page, I stole this from a Congressional Research Service report from 2005, so it's a little bit dated. Unfortunately, not much has changed. Public Diplomacy, a review of past recommendations, has this graphic on page 2. On the left-hand side, you may not be able to see it very well from your seats, are a list of studies done over the course, basically since 9/11. So you have the 9/11 Commission, the Government Accountability Office, there's a RAND report, the DeGerjan report, and then you have several Public Diplomacy Commission reports. It's an annual report put out by the Commission as a requirement of the Smith-Mundt Act to review U.S. public diplomacy. And then across the top, you have the recommendations that each of these reports made. And I've highlighted the ones that have real resonance not only to my research, but also connections to the historic development of public diplomacy in the U.S. So the first one's a doozy, define overall strategy, which I would argue is connected to defining its role in statecraft. And then you have reorganize public diplomacy at the White House, create a new agency, reorganize it at the State Department, redefine the role of the Undersecretary of Public Diplomacy, coordinate better. So let's just take those ones first. These, I would argue, are either organizational or strategic issues that confront public diplomacy. And the coordinate better, I think, is a real stumbling block in terms of the stakeholders that are invested in public diplomacy. So the State Department kind of owns public diplomacy, but you're also looking at the CIA and the Department of Defense and the overlap in those missions, especially when you're thinking of ISIS and Al-Qaeda and organizations like that. The last two I highlighted because they're major things that came out in my research. Increased private sector involvement. One of the things that I noticed after I had done all of this historical research was how integral private entities were to the development and continuity of American foreign public engagement. They were crucial. Without them, we would not have public diplomacy today, I would argue. And the difference between, say, the Cold War and post 9/11 public diplomacy is this: I don't see those partnerships between the government and the private sector as much as they had existed prior to the 9/11. The improved communication, I'm going to break that down further. This is a kind of consistent theme going from Ben Franklin all the way up through the present. And I'm going to discuss that more in the rest of this presentation. Slide, please. So reading U.S. government reports, audits, and congressional hearings, in addition to the growing scholarly literature on public diplomacy, the problem areas, I would argue, can roughly be confined in these 3 areas. And each of these areas are very much connected to America's past, as I will be discussing through the rest of this presentation. So conceptual, as I already hinted at the beginning of this presentation, there's some debate as to what is public diplomacy. What should it do? What should it not do? What should it be used for? And then the other one, organizational. This again refers to both the bureaucratic and strategic problems with public diplomacy. And the crucial research question that I had is, where does it fit into statecraft? And then ideological, and I'll be interested to hear what your thoughts are on this one. This one's, I don't quite think I've got a good term for kind of conceptualizing the problems here, but it's a number of things. It refers to a number of problems with U.S. public diplomacies. It's connected to the deep-rooted beliefs about America's relationship with the world and defining what that relationship should be in the context of these beliefs. So Walter McDougall in Promised Land and Crusader States remarked that U.S. diplomacy is a compilation of traditions and ideas that have kind of been amassed over the years. And some of them kind of fit together really well, and others of them kind of clash. And it's reconciling those with our current situation in the world. And sometimes those don't always work out, and there's not consensus. The other aspect of this ideological bit is America's values are universally appealing, and as former Professor Juliana Pilon wrote in an article in 2008, democracy's appeal was assumed as self-evident. It meant that in the US, strategic diplomacy and global communications have generally been an afterthought. Americans assumed that their democratic system and their motives required no rhetorical defense. The pride which faithfully accompanied the otherwise commendable American religion of freedom would eventually prove to be a handicap. The result has been a sorry chronicle of dismally ineffective public diplomacy. And kind of on top of that, or connected to that, is how sometimes American foreign policies or American public diplomacy is projected as being indicative of good foreign policy. So these principles are supposed to be equal to our foreign policies, and that gets us into trouble sometimes. And I'll explain that later in the presentation, what I mean by that, and give you some examples. Slide. So let's start with the first one, the concept. As some of you may have already known, and this may be history rehashed, and I hope to kind of bring new insights into this, the connection between public diplomacy and propaganda ultimately really refers back to World War I and the Committee on Public Information. The CPI was divided into two sections: the domestic section, which was stood up in April 1917 with an executive order, and the foreign section, which started operations in September of 1917 but didn't actually become an official part of the organization until December of 1917, when Wilson issued another executive order. The foreign section's main objective was to inform the foreign public about the U.S. generally and about its war policies and objectives. To this end, the foreign section employed many of the same methods as identified by Nick Cull: listening, international broadcasting, advocacy, and even exchanges. Though historically viewed as a propaganda agency, the individuals working at the CPI did not define their work as propaganda, nor was it originally intended as a propaganda organization. It was supposed to be a censorship organization. And when this idea of conducting war censorship reached journalists, they became alarmed. And Wilson received a lot of input from people like George Creel, Walter Lippmann, and other journalists when setting up the organization. And just as Wilson issued the executive order creating the CPI, a journalist, Arthur Bullard, wrote an article criticizing the Wilson administration for the way he conducted diplomacy. He wrote it in the Atlantic Monthly in April of 1917. And this is the excerpt from it. "It is an anomaly, a denial of our democratic faith that our republic should accredit its ambassadors to kings and not to the peoples of Europe." He advocated for what he termed democratic diplomacy, and he specifically highlighted Ben Franklin and Abraham Lincoln as people who had conducted democratic diplomacy, whereby the U.S. would engage with the people of other nations directly rather than governments. And kind of coupled with that concept of democratic diplomacy, you have Ernest Poole, who would later head up the foreign section, wrote to George Creel, "Remember that the coming year is to see more people's diplomacy and more propaganda of all kinds than in any year so far in the war." There was this growing sentiment among not only the people in the CPI, but also President Wilson, that as the world became more democratized, it would make more sense if our diplomacy was directed at people rather than the governments. And this is something that becomes an issue again towards the end of World War II, when the Department of State is doing post-war planning, and it was part of the impetus for continuing a lot of the information programs. American fear of propaganda and its use of by government predates World War I and is rooted in alarming assumptions about American society and democracy. Ironically, Americans became aware of the power of mass persuasion at the beginning of the 20th century with exposés written by the same muckraking journalists who would eventually work for the CPI, including Arthur Bullard, Ernest Poole, and Bill Irwin. Americans also reacted to the quick advancement of communication technology and the onset of modern mass communications. Several other factors existed prior to the war which further compounded the impact of the CPI and the use of propaganda throughout World War I on the American psyche. more and more American leaders and those involved with the CPI began to lose faith in the rationality of the American public, even before the war began. Adding to this loss of faith in the people themselves was the confusion which existed regarding the actual definition of propaganda. The many definitions for the concept of propaganda made the goal of exposing it or finding methods to defend general public against the influence of propaganda difficult. And this remains an issue even today. So as we have trouble defining what public diplomacy is, we also have trouble reaching a consensus about what propaganda is. And if we're trying to, if we are separating those terms because we don't like propaganda as a nation because it violates our liberal sensibilities, then we have a problem because both terms are indistinct and confused. The personnel of the CPI were well aware of the American public's fear and repulsion toward propaganda, and as such tried to distance themselves from any reference to the term or practice. And yet they used the term regularly in official documents to refer to the many activities conducted by the CPI. Not only was the word propaganda used to describe CPI activities, but the term was also used interchangeably with words such as educate, advertise, publicize, journalism, and news to identify their work. And people did not always distinguish between what the CPI was doing and from what the Germans or other nations were doing as well. The main point here is that for Americans in 1917, or even today, to attempt to distinguish propaganda from other forms of foreign public engagement is made difficult by America's own experience and non-specific understanding of what the CPI did in World War I. This confusion over the necessity and appropriateness of engaging with publics overseas and the disapproval of propaganda remains unresolved after the CPI ceased operations abroad in the spring of 1919. And just as a side note, to kind of add to this kind of confusion, the Department of State just did a special foreign relations of the United States. They released it in December on the foreign activities of the Department of State as part of their public diplomacy series. So it's like kind of a recognition that this is public diplomacy, even though common knowledge kind of equates the CPI as a propaganda organization. So there's, again, this conceptual kind of unclarity that exists. By the end of the 1930s, By the end of the 1930s, the U.S. government began to take a renewed interest in foreign public engagement. The growing tensions in Asia and Europe caused President Roosevelt to call for a special Pan-American conference in early 1936. And just as a side note, Pan-American Union is a predecessor to what we today know as the Organization of American States. The Pan-American Conference for the Maintenance of Peace would not only discuss the arrangement of academic exchanges, but the Department of State actually drafted a treaty to be discussed at the conference. The treaty was accepted by the other nations of the Union, and it went on to be confirmed by the Senate. The Convention for the Promotion of Inter-American Cultural Relations was the underlying impetus for creating the Division of Cultural Relations in the Department of State in 1938. As Nazi Germany made quick advances across Europe in the spring of 1940, President Roosevelt created other agencies primarily to secure the safety of the U.S., but also to fend off Nazi influence. By the spring of 1941, there were at least 5 agencies within the U.S. government, aside from the Department of State's Division of Cultural Relations and Division of Current Information, which were responsible for disseminating information or engaging with people abroad. So just real briefly, this graphic up here, and unfortunately, this is my graphic, so it may be a bit confusing. What I was trying to do is demonstrate a couple of things. Over time, the establishment of the different agencies that were set up. So roughly from 1938 to 1941, you had this mess of organizations within the U.S. government that were all basically tasked to do the same thing in one way or another. And then it also shows here their relationship to the president, which is also kind of important when you're talking about where does it fit in statecraft. So one of the problems the Division of Cultural Relations had was they had no direct access to the president. They were also tremendously underfunded. The coordinator of Inter-American Affairs had an excellent relationship with President Roosevelt and Congress, and he was funded up to his eyeballs. The Office of War Information, as it would later be known by 1942, was also very well funded because it was seen as a defense organization. In an effort to consolidate these agencies, President Roosevelt created the Office of War Information, leaving just the Coordinator of Inter-American Affairs and the Division of Cultural Relations separate. Each of these agencies used the same methods to engage with people abroad, including radio news and entertainment broadcasts, educational and cultural exchange, film, books, and libraries. Yet they were all created with a specific intent or objective in mind, which forced each organization to interpret their own connection to U.S. foreign policy and foreign relations. All three agencies also referred to their work using different words or phrases, despite the similar methods of engagement. And these terms or phrases included international cooperation, propaganda, psychological warfare, cultural relations, and information work. And kind of as a side note, the Office of War Information and the OSS had a long drawn-out battle over terminology between propaganda and psychological warfare through much of the war, and it was never really resolved. Okay, slide.
Okay, what again are the two organizations that were well-funded?
The Coordinator for Inter-American Affairs, so the Rockefeller Organization, and the Office of War Information.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so this is the ideological part of the problem area that I talked about at the beginning of this presentation. So U.S. principles as public diplomacy. In March 1777, Benjamin Franklin wrote to the Continental Congress, "The want of intelligence affects the cause of the United States in every department. What accounts of our affairs arrive in Europe at all comes through the hands of our enemies, and whether defeated or victorious, we are the last who are acquainted with events, which ought first to be announced by us. We are really unable to account for this silence, and while we are affected with the unhappy consequences of it, must entreat the honorable Congress to devise some method for giving us the earliest and most certain intelligence of what passes in America." Franklin needed news about what was going on in the colonies to encourage foreign aid and support for the American Revolution. And unfortunately, due to the British Navy and multiple spies, which were inhabiting Ben Franklin's home in France, as well as other issues, he wasn't able to get a lot of the intelligence that was coming from the Continental Congress. They were sending it, but he couldn't get it. So when Franklin left for France in December of 1776, he was aware of what faced him in France, and he was facing a big uphill battle. So he needed to define U.S. national identity to a people that had fought a war with the colonies just 10 years before. He also needed to dissuade people from adopt their stereotype of colonists in general. So Comte de Buffon was noted for his degenerative thesis, which he circulated in Europe and gained a lot of traction. And this posited that if you stayed too long in the colonies, you would degenerate as a human being. You would become more barbaric. You wouldn't be as tall. You wouldn't be as physically fit. You wouldn't be mentally capable of a lot of things. And Ben Franklin actually knew this because he experienced it when he first went to England as a printing apprentice. People were surprised that he could speak English and that he could read. So you had that. And that was still a thing going on when he traveled there in 1776. He also needed to portray America as a good investment. America needed trade partners. They needed somebody to invest in them. And he needed these things because he also knew that the French government was in no position to assist the U.S. colonies at the time. They had no navy and no money, and they weren't interested in starting a war with England at the time. And they had already made him very much aware of that. They gave him covert assistance, but it was very limited. So Franklin knew he was going to have to use private assistance in order to get America through the first few months of the war. And so the fact that he didn't have good intelligence didn't help. So when he arrived there, the foreign minister, Comte de Vernet, did a very nice thing. He set up this newsprint on the far left here. And it basically is the affairs of the English and America. And this is a big deal because this was the only newsprint, aside from 2 others, that were sanctioned by the French government, because France at that time was basically a police state with a thriving black market on illicit prints. Anyway, so this print was supposed to broadly educate the French public about America, the colonies, and so forth. It was supposed to spread the news about the American Revolution. Well, when Ben Franklin didn't have news from the colonies, he had the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and several state constitutions printed or translated and printed in this newsprint as a way of demonstrating not only national identity, our values and principles, also to demonstrate that democracy was not going to devolve into anarchy, that it was actually a very, thought out process, that it was very organized, and that America was a good investment. He did the same thing with the Leyden Gazette, which is the newsprint on the right here, through another one of his printing contacts, Charles Francis Dumas. He got in touch with the editor here, Jean Luzac. This was printed in The Hague, and this is rather significant because the Netherlands played an important role in the American Revolution. Without them, we wouldn't have had a lot of the materials and supplies, because you had a divide in the Netherlands. The people, mostly merchants and traders, wanted freedom of the seas. They wanted to be able to trade, and the government wanted to honor their alliance with England. So in this Leyden Gazette, Ben Franklin wrote several articles talking up about how America was such a good investment, advocating for the freedom of the seas. And this became a huge issue by the end of the American Revolution. So here you have 2 examples of advocacy and international broadcasting in the 18th century. And on top of that, you have an example where a public diplomat was basically using our values and principles as a nation in order to identify our identity and to stand up for our values and our policies as a nation, which works really well when your policies and your values are in sync. But in 2002, with the Shared Values Initiative, as Rhonda Zarna writes in her Battles to Bridges book, this backfired on us. So the Department of State did this very nice campaign kind of emphasizing the shared values that we have with the Muslim population in the Middle East and Asia. At the same time, we were invading Afghanistan, and there were a lot of other things going on that from the Muslim population, this kind of didn't jive with the same values that we were projecting in this campaign. So it sort of backfired. And this is where you see where sometimes if you're using public diplomacy and you're depending on your values to project that, you have to kind of sit back and think, is this kind of connecting with my foreign policy? Slide. Okay, so this is kind of organization and strategy. So problems facing this. The question of strategy, bureaucracy, and appropriateness of foreign public engagement was a major concern throughout much of the Civil War. While recognizing the need for foreign public engagement, the Lincoln administration had difficulties incorporating foreign public engagement into statecraft while also maintaining concerns about domestic issues going on, obviously the Civil War. So in October of 1861, Secretary of State William Seward learned 2 things. First, the Confederates were sending 2 commissioners to Britain and France, James Mason and John Slidell. Second, General Winfield Scott wanted to retire from the U.S. Army and travel to Europe for his health. While there, he offered to engage with the public of Britain and France to advocate for the Union. Seward was extremely alarmed by the news of Mason and Slidell. And as Seward wrote later to Ambassador Charles Francis Adams, grandson to John Adams, who is the ambassador in Britain, he said, "We thought we had reason to apprehend new and very serious dangers in Europe. The subject was taken into consideration that the insurgents, the Confederates, were represented abroad by a number of active, unscrupulous, and plausible men who manifestly were acquiring influence in society and in the press, and employing it with dangerous effect. And it was thought that such efforts could be profitably counteracted by the presence in London and Paris of some loyal, high-spirited, and intellectual men of social position and character. It was decided that hazard must be incurred in view of dangers which seemed so imminent. The persons selected were thought to be the most prudent and considerate in the country. When all our agents and friends abroad, consular as well as diplomatic, official, and unofficial persons, united in warning us of a serious danger. So I'm going to kind of break that up a little bit because that was a bit long there. Let's start with the bit about it was decided that hazard must be incurred. So when they decided to send basically foreign public agents overseas, and yes, in October they did decide to send 3 quasi-official representatives to Britain and France to engage with the public. It was a big debate as to whether or not it was appropriate. Should they be doing it? And this is kind of interesting if you take into consideration that just on the other side of the century, we'd be talking about it in terms of propaganda. So they were talking about it in terms of, is this diplomatic? Is this something a state should be doing? Is this a part of our statecraft that we should be sending people abroad to engage with people of another nation? And a lot of people were really divided on this. It was obviously decided that it was more important to national security and concerns of Confederate involvement in England and France that they go ahead and send them anyway. So they sent them. The other part that's kind of interesting too is the part where he says that Seward was warned by agents, friends abroad, consular, as well as diplomatic, official and unofficial persons about the influence of the Confederacy on public opinion abroad. Why is this interesting? Because Seward was repeatedly warned and he ignored it regularly throughout the entirety of the Civil War. So another ambassador, Carl Schurz, warned him about Union policies and how they were being interpreted and understood abroad, and how this was kind of negatively impacting the Union's image and ability to conduct foreign relations abroad. And Seward wrote back to Carl Schurz. He said, "It is never to be forgotten that although the sympathy of other nations is eminently desirable, yet foreign sympathy or even foreign favor never did and never can create or maintain a state." So he basically said, public opinion doesn't really matter in terms of the grand scheme of things. Governments and states are way more important than public opinion. Adams also warned Seward that the British government considered public opinion when determining national policies. At the time of the Civil War, Lord Palmerston had a coalition government. British politics were very unsteady, and they very much were dependent on public opinion, even though they didn't have universal suffrage. And Adams regularly warned Seward about this. Seward remained unmoved by these, and here we have a case where engagement could have informed policy in many instances throughout the Civil War, but for various reasons, information gathered by listening was ignored by the Department of State or Seward. And there were a lot of domestic reasons as to why that was written off. There was concern about losing the border states if they made the war about abolishing slavery. There was concern about being able to recruit people in the North if they abolished slavery. So there was a lot of, hesitation about kind of caving to what public opinion abroad thought. However, when they sent, you got Thurlow Weed and Bishop Charles McIlvaine were sent abroad to advocate in Great Britain. They were supposed to advocate on behalf of the Union. It turned into a crisis mission because as they arrived, the Trent crisis occurred. So here in the middle here is a letter written in the Times of London by General Winfield Scott trying to explain away why the Trent crisis wasn't actually a big deal and don't worry about it. But the whole purpose behind these people going to Britain was to actually explain the Union's reasons for war, why they were prosecuting the war the way they were. But that's not what ended up happening. It turned into a crisis management situation. So the other aspect of the Weed mission was Adams' reaction to it. So Charles Adams was not informed by Seward that Thurlow Weed and Bishop M'Elvane had been sent over there until Thurlow Weed knocked on the door at the embassy and said, "I'm here." So Adams later on gave Seward some of his ideas of what he thought about it. He said, "It is due to my sense of the public interest to add that my remark is confined to persons who come here in their apparent private position. There is a difficulty in regard to employing recognized official representatives to other governments in the same way which will not fail to be injuriously felt whenever the experiment is attempted. They necessarily occupy a false position in the face of the regularly accredited agent, or they force him into one. They must be wholly admitted into his confidence, in which case they cannot fail to take his responsibility out of his hands, or they must be kept out of it, where there is perpetual danger of running into contradictions which neutralize the influence of both." So we'll just start with that part there. So he basically said that if you're going to send people over here to engage with the public, make them private. Don't send official representatives, because now you've got competing entities over here who are representing the U.S. government. He also says, which is another, I think, interesting connection to some of the issues that come up in public diplomacy today, is the relationship between that engagement and the mission. So he says they either all have to be linked up on the same page, or they need to be completely separate. And the danger of them being completely separate is that they step on each other's toes and make each other ineffective. So I think there's some real kind of interesting connections there between some of the things that you read about in practitioners' experience with public diplomacy overseas and in the mission. So the interesting thing is that a lot of Adams' recommendations were taken to heart, because the next group of people that were sent over to advocate on behalf of the Union were not given credentials, were not really talked about at all. And former Secretary of State Edward Everett, who initially turned down the first opportunity to do this mission because he felt it was inappropriate, went the second time. So, and there was no press coverage, that he was very quiet. It was very difficult to find anything that he was doing in the records. There was just a brief message between him and Lincoln, and then he left to go to Britain and advocate on behalf of the Union. Slide, please. Okay, so the other thing, aside from kind of getting at the origins of public diplomacy issues, so kind of getting back beyond, 20th century, World War I, World War II, some of the old history, the other thing that this project allowed me to do was to see patterns across history. So what are the consistencies between Ben Franklin and public diplomats today? And these were some of the patterns that I found, which probably don't make much sense to you right now on this graphic, but don't worry, I'm going to talk about them, which may make them less sense anyway, but I'll try. So these are some of the patterns: communication, methods of engagement, people and organizations, private versus public, foreign public engagement, and the cooperation between the two. So, slide. One of the recurring themes I found in each of the cases I looked at, of which there were 6, was the importance of communication. And this manifested in 3 different ways. So first, the need to communicate or engage with people overseas in order to represent the U.S., not just governments. This was an imperative for both Benjamin Franklin and Charles Francis Adams, as well as many private entities who resided overseas. Benjamin Franklin wrote in another panicked letter to the Continental Congress, "Our total ignorance of the truth or falsehood of facts when questions are asked of us concerning them makes us appear small in the eyes of the people here and is prejudicial to our negotiations." I love that quote, because he's saying that because we don't know things and because we aren't able to represent ourselves, other people are representing us for us, and it's not good. They're spreading lies or they're spreading half-truths, and this is inhibiting our ability to accomplish the things that you want us to accomplish over here. It was a common complaint among private entities working and traveling abroad. U.S. citizens, and in some cases official representatives, complained about the way America was represented abroad, observing how America was hated or not respected. So another gentleman who was traveling through Europe in the 1930s wrote several letters to Secretary Cordell Hull saying that, the foreign press doesn't really represent us very well. It's very sensational. We need a full representation of who America is as a people and a culture and a history. And other nations do this. Why don't we? The second area where we saw communication kind of consistently throughout each of the cases was how communication technology inevitably helped or hindered U.S. foreign public engagement. As we saw in earlier in this presentation, the lack of communication technology or the means to communicate greatly inhibited Benjamin Franklin. However, advancements in communication technology just before the outbreak of the Civil War caused problems for the Union throughout the war. Seward's anti-British remarks often caused the British public opinion to turn against him. And Henry Adams, son of Charles Francis Adams, wrote this to his brother: "The impression is general that Mr. Seward is resolved to insult England until she makes war. Mr. Seward is an ogre fully resolved to eat all Englishmen raw." And this was something that was also discussed a lot in the press. They just thought that everything that came out of Seward's mouth was just very anti-British. And Adams tried to warn Seward that he needed to guard his remarks more because of the cable. A lot of what people were saying in the U.S. was being reported a few days afterwards. So I think there's a lot of resonance with some of the things that we face today in terms of public diplomacy and what officials say and how quickly that gets broadcast around the world. Technology was also a blessing and a curse during World War I. U.S. access to cable service was severely inhibited after the start of World War I with the severing of the Atlantic cable, the very same one that was the bane of Seward's existence, causing the CPI to rely on a patchwork comms network, which included relying on Europe's wire service. On the other hand, the ease of publication and the advent of film provided new means of mass communication and engagement. So actually, at one point, Woodrow Wilson was so frustrated with the U.S. communication industry, he actually nationalized parts of the communication industry. And it was sort of this move that allowed the U.S. to break into the radio technology and remained competitive after the war. But prior to that, a lot of the cable and telegraph service was owned by European countries, and the U.S. didn't really have a foot in there, and that became a problem during World War I. Thirdly, the other way that this communication pattern manifested itself was the problem of communicating between headquarters and the field, which, if you've worked in government, this is probably something that is always on the minds of people who've either worked overseas or work here in Washington, this kind of reconciling the two and getting everyone on the same page. Often, the field would advise headquarters of public sentiments in a foreign nation. Headquarters either ignored the information or chastised the field for reporting it, as we saw with Seward getting information about public opinion from various people. Additionally, headquarters often did not adequately inform the field about U.S. politics, current events, or even foreign policies. And some of this could be blamed on the lack of communication technology or networks, but some of it was due to institutional practice not rectified until 1934. So in 1934, the Department of State created the Information Service. And what was interesting to me was the response by ambassadors and consulars to this service was the way that they talked about it. They made it seem like they had never been fully informed about U.S. policies and what was going on. This was also something that Charles Adams complained about during the Civil War. So when the Trent crisis happened, he didn't find out that Mason and Slidell had been released until it was reported in the British press. And he mentioned something to Seward, and Seward wrote back, "Oh yeah, we released them. I figured you'd find out in the press eventually." And that was kind of his attitude towards it. He didn't see why he needed to keep Adams informed about the policies back at home. And when Adams suggested that the Union needed to be more proactive about abolishing slavery, Stewart got really angry and said, we can't do this. This is very dangerous. But he didn't explain why it was so dangerous to Adams so that he could maybe explain that to the British public. And then when the information service was started, you had the consular officer of Barbados who said that he was absolutely ecstatic that the service had been set up because he had been asked repeatedly by the local media and the government questions, and he didn't know the answers to them. He didn't know, what U.S. policies were on certain things. This was also an issue during World War II with the Office of War Information. The frustration with the Office of War Information was they were trying to marry up U.S. Public diplomacy or engagement with military operations. And the Department of State insisted on maintaining their control of foreign policy. But as the military would liberate with certain regions, OWI would go back and say, so what's our policy in this region? If it's a former British colony, are we advocating for the end of colonies? And a lot of the time, the Department of State would say something like, we'll get back to you, or we haven't decided yet, we'll get back to you. And they're like, we can't wait around, we've got to get this out. So there's this disconnect between the field and headquarters. And I think that's something that still exists today. Slide. So another key theme is the ways in which various entities throughout history sought to engage with the people of other nations, whether using the core practices identified by Nick Call or looking at them more generally. There's only so many ways that a person can engage with another person. So if you think about it, you're going to engage with somebody from another country. How are you going to do that? You're going to do it face to face. You're going to do it through the phone. You're going to do it. So there's only so many ways. Those are tactical, technical ways to engage somebody. So there was a consistent, recognized need to communicate with people of other nations. This need was divided between the desire to accurately represent the United States and to develop friendly relations with the people of other nations, in addition to representing and kind of espousing U.S. liberal principles, ensuring that truthful, accurate information was presented around the world. On the other side, education and cultural exchanges also remained a consistent practice of international engagement, dating all the way back to 1818, with U.S. missionaries arranging Greek students to come to the United States, Chinese students to come to the United States to study, and U.S. missionaries setting up schools all throughout the Middle East and Asia, many which are still in existence today. And this was, whether they intended it that way or not, it ended up being a way to represent the United States. There was a lot of cultural transfer, and it also helped to kind of establish friendly relations and a network that's still in existence and was utilized during the Cold War by USIA and the Department of State in public diplomacy during the Cold War. The reasons or intent behind the engagement is crucial to understanding the role of public diplomacy in statecraft, as well as reconceptualizing public diplomacy in the context of U.S. historical experience and political culture. Looking at the evolution of U.S. public diplomacy from 1776 up through the passage of the Smith-Mundt Act afforded the opportunity to see foreign public engagement without the stigma of propaganda. And from this vantage point, I believe there's a lot of merit to Arthur Bullard's democratic diplomacy. The idea that a liberal democratic nation which believes in the sovereignty of people should conduct diplomacy reflecting these ideas. Slide. So this is the last slide, and I'm going to try and cover both of the last two themes. So the one theme was the importance of people and organizations. So this is you probably unfortunately can't see this chart very well. This is a social network analysis chart that I manually created because unfortunately the missionaries in the 19th century did not use Twitter, Facebook, or email. What this demonstrates is from so over here you have the missionaries, and it goes all the way up. So on the other side here you have Edward R. Murrow. So what this shows is people, private organizations, and U.S. government and their connections across history, okay? From literally the 19th century all the way up through World War II, okay? So this is the history of US public diplomacy, okay, right here on this slide. And what this shows is that from about the 19th century, the turn of the 19th century, up through the passage of the Smith-Mundt Bill, you have these private entities and private organizations like the Carnegie Endowment for Peace, the Rockefeller Foundation, the American Red Cross, the American Library Association, the YMCA, who were integral in not only continuing foreign public engagement when the government bowed out or was no longer interested, or who helped the government when they were interested. So during the Committee on Public Information's existence, a lot of their activities were facilitated by the YMCA, American Missionaries, and the American Red Cross. Arthur Bullard often worked with the American Red Cross in Russia to help distribute materials in some of the outer regions and more remote areas. The American Missionaries also helped to distribute CPI war films and newsreels on the back of trucks, which should sound familiar to what happened during the Cold War. So these people are important, and what I would love to do in the future is kind of delve into the background and history of these individuals, because I think these individuals shed a lot of light on the ideas behind what is appropriate for American public diplomacy, what role it should play. So there's an interesting conversation between two individuals up here, James Brown Scott and Nicholas Murray Butler. These two were ones who suggested in 1910 that the Department of State advocate for academic exchanges between Latin America and the US at the 1910 Fourth Pan American Conference. What was interesting about these two is they had this long discussion about the appropriateness of foreign public engagement and what its purpose was. James Brown Scott saw it as being more connected to foreign policy and expanding American influence and American economic prowess or expansion. Nicholas Murray Butler saw it as more of an internationalist, feel-good, we're promoting good relations, we're promoting the peaceful relations among countries. So already you have two individuals here that would eventually be on the Carnegie Endowment Board, directing the law, international law, and education portions of the Carnegie Endowment funds. So it's these kind of connections that I think need more research, need more kind of bringing out and kind of connecting how did these people influence US public diplomacy. Because when we get to the Division of Cultural Relations, these same individuals were invited by the Department of State to advise how the Division of Cultural Relations should be set up, how their work should be done, what kinds of practices they should be using. Actually, Stephen Dugan, who is the owner and creator of the Institute of International Education, which was partially supported by the Carnegie Endowment, he was on the advisory committee. And his son was also a part of, Lawrence Dugan was also part of the Division of Cultural Relations within the Department of State. So all these kind of overlapping connections are really important, I think, and unfortunately in my research I didn't have time to really pull them out. Kind of coupled with this and in the same graphic is you seeing the relationship between the government and the private, okay? What Emily Rosenberg referred to as the chosen instrument. And I like that phrase because it's very appropriate. At the end of World War I, America refused to join the League of Nations, and it was a no-go political hot button issue. And unfortunately, it wasn't an area that the Department of State could avoid. There were 41 nations in the League of Nations. You can't ignore that. So in steps the Carnegie Endowment for Peace. You had Elihu Root, Nicholas Murray Butler, and James Brown Scott, who were really supportive of the League of Nations and wanted to see the U.S. become involved with it. So what ended up happening was Carnegie Endowment became sort of a chosen instrument or a go-between between the Department of State and the League of Nations, setting up schools like the Institute of, where'd it go, if it's on here? It's the, I'm going to butcher it in French, it's the Institut de Hautes Internationales. It's the international study of relations in Geneva. which is still in existence today. They also established other schools. But what's interesting is it wasn't just the Carnegie Endowment who was also doing it. It was also the Laura Spelman Rockefeller Memorial Foundation was also very active in it, along with their board members. So you see how these people, when the government said we shouldn't be doing foreign public engagement, it's not appropriate for us, you still had private entities who felt it was important and were willing to kind of tacitly work unofficially on behalf of the government as chosen instruments. And it was this kind of developing relationship that eventually became more and more formalized, and it's something that you see manifested throughout the Cold War. And I don't think, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, this was something I think I saw in either an IG report or a GAO report, where there is an office inside the Department of State responsible for creating private partnerships, but they hadn't really been well thought out, or they started them and they hadn't projected what that relationship would look like. And that's really unfortunate, because I see that this is it was a good relationship, particularly when the Division of Cultural Relations started, because the government's role was facilitator, administrator. They weren't actually doing the engagement, and they didn't want to do the engagement. They were merely bringing these private entities together to kind of act as a clearinghouse, and where need be, facilitate those engagements when other governments maybe got in the way, or they needed help, in some other kind of administrative sort of way. But as World War II became more and more of an issue for the United States, you had other agencies created, and the dynamics for the Division of Cultural Relations changed. That's all I got. Thank you very much. I hope it wasn't too boring for you. A lot of history there. Thank you.
Thank you, Caitlin. I presume you'll take some questions.
Of course. I hope I left time for you guys to ask questions. I know you're leaving soon.
Thank you. I want to jump in because I definitely see. I'm going to take. I much appreciate the historical overview. I can see the influence of the Cole. I've met several times over the years. But since I've been with the state for so long, let me defend the
Okay.
institution a little bit. The Office of Private-Public Partnerships has been around at least 3 years.
Okay.
It was in response to, I think, some of the observations and criticisms of the private sector that we needed this. I heard one of their presentations. They seem to do a pretty good job. They're an advocate for it and a consulting role. They help public affairs officers make the connections, and they offer guidelines for how it should be done properly within the rules and the legal frameworks. I want to go back to something you said at the beginning, because we hear the state gets a lot of criticism from the academy, from the press, and from the Hill about not having if you put it in your own terms, let's see, the role of public diplomacy in statecraft / strategy not well defined.
Mm-hmm.
Because in response to criticisms of that sort, we now have the quadrennial review.
Mm-hmm.
So we had one 4 years ago. There's a new one issued about 6 weeks ago. That's a pretty good, I think, organizational framework and description of where public diplomacy and what we're trying to achieve with foreign policy. Also, in the Bush 2 years, Bush 43, Judith McHale issued a public diplomacy framework, which also I think does a pretty good role, just in a theoretical sort of sense. What is public diplomacy? Where does it fit in? And tries to offer a sop of some sort to the criticism that we're getting from the outside. And we're aware of that. We use that. I'm in the Office of the Inspector General. We use that as a template and as a standard for what our missions have to be doing.
Okay, I have to offer my apologies. I did not mean to lambast or disparage. I think the Department of State has an unfair share of responsibility for what I see to be a collective thing that the government needs to decide to do. So where I see the issue of statecraft, I'm not saying that it's on the Department of State to make that happen. That needs to happen both at the White House and with Congress, is what I see. Because I had to look institutionally at the Department of State. And unfortunately, do you know why it's called the Department of State? You know that bit of trivia?
It's a good question.
Okay, I'll share it. I'll share it quickly. Okay, so for 2 weeks in the nation's history, it was the Department of Foreign Affairs. It lasted for 2 weeks, okay? It didn't last long because it was a very contentious debate in the first Congress. The argument was severalfold. We don't want foreigners corrupting what we have. And that was literally an argument. We were afraid of foreign influence. 2, we didn't need a foreign affairs office at all because we didn't need foreign relations, okay? We have oceans. We don't need to interact with them. And the third argument was, since we're not having foreign relations, the foreign affairs isn't going to have much to do. We can add more duties to them. So they literally made it the Secretary of State. They gave him the responsibility of keeping track of the sale of land, corresponding with all the governors of state, and maintaining the records of the American Revolution, hence the National Archives. So for the longest time, they were literally the Secretary of State. And as you may or may not know, for much of the Department of State's history as an administrative organization in the Washington side, I think through much of the 19th century, they only had 13 employees. The organization wasn't professionalized until the Roger Act was passed in 1922. So I think, and what I got from a lot of the material that I read on U.S. public diplomacy was, especially from within the State Department, it wasn't that they didn't want to do it, there was a fear of Congress's reaction. Because historically, Congress was really kind of negative towards the concept of diplomacy and doing diplomacy. So anytime somebody suggested doing, cultural relations, it wasn't that they were against it or they didn't want to do it. It was they were afraid of Congress's reaction. And kind of coupled with that, we need, statecraft and strategy type thing, I would highlight the recent bill that was proposed by Congressman Royce to change the operation of the Broadcasting Board of Governors and Voice of America. There was a lot of backlash from Voice America journalists who said, that's not what we do. So in my academic eyes, what Congress expects of public diplomacy is more along the lines of propaganda. They expect the results of propaganda without using the term. And this is kind of the disconnect. You can disagree.
You actually touched on a lot of new themes that we can't consume and talk about.
Yeah.
You actually didn't mention when you introduced the term public diplomacy. Usually, the Academy mentions is it Frederick Guillen of Tufts University?
Yeah.
And he introduced public diplomacy as an alternative to the stigma of propaganda.
Yeah.
That's how I understood it.
Yeah, and it's true, but I think from what I learned in the historical perspective is that there's actually room for this concept of public diplomacy in the terms of diplomacy and how we think of it as representation and relationship building. And when you think of it in those terms, it's not so much about communicating and communicating better and communicating more. It becomes more dynamic. And it's not so much about, yes, you're going to persuade people. Nick Cull's got advocacy and psychological warfare up there as one of the core, that's one of the elements of it, but it's not the primary thing. And I think that's, where the problem is that we kind of have to decide as a nation, what is this that we're doing? What is okay to do? What is not okay to do? And I don't think that's necessarily solely the responsibility of the Department of State. Unfortunately, they get handed the bag. Yes.
I'm Ross Johnson.
Hi.
A couple questions, I suppose. I wish we could ban the term propaganda because it obfuscates discussion in so many areas, and I look forward to reading how you've dealt with that at various points of history. Your last comment is a case, and I think you actually have to, in analyzing any document in American foreign policy, whatever, that uses the term, you actually have to explain what's being meant, which I do sometimes. Your last comment there, points up the sort of the dilemma of the issue here. I'm involved in a sense in the legislative reform on international broadcasting.
Mhm.
It's certainly not the intent of the Voice bill to turn the Voice of America into a propaganda operation.
Mhm.
Jim Glassman spoke, I think, pretty persuasively about that
Mhm.
recently. Is it supposed to do the things that are in the VOA charter? Yes. And so, we get into the whole issue of language and terms. So again, I think propaganda is a term, in some languages it's quite a neutral concept.
Yeah.
It's advertising, basically, as you know. And you allude to some of those issues. I wish we could abolish the term. Any comments you have would be fine. But there's another issue here, and I wonder if you address it or if you have a comment on values and policy and all that.
Mhm.
Whatever the United States tries to do in this area has to somehow take into account and deal with and counteract, what many would call the very harmful impact of another kind of communication coming out of the United States. I'm talking about American popular culture and the impact that has. Take the Muslim world, that
Yeah,
kind of thing.
yeah.
This is Martha Bale's.
Yeah.
book
Through the
and all
screen
that.
darkly.
And so, one can make the argument that part of what American official public diplomacy has to do is counter, offset, somehow neutralize
Mhm.
some of the, some of the negative parts of American popular
Mhm.
culture, the violence and all the stuff that
Mhm.
it seems to dominate thinking about the United States in some parts of the world.
Mhm.
Any reaction?
I agree, and I think historically, because they, in the 1930s, when film and radio broadcasts were starting to be used, and you had private philanthropic organizations who saw film and radio as an element of educating the public, using it as an education tool. And not solely a pop culture entertainment mechanism, which is obviously the way it went. So I think to comment on that, the idea was and still is that, as you said, there needs to be kind of a full picture painted. And I think, unfortunately, and people can correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that period between when the USIA was absorbed into the State Department and then 9/11 happened, there was kind of this attitude by policymakers or political leaders that, we have CNN, we have Hollywood, we have all these popular culture outlets, and America's just hugely popular for our popular culture exports, that we don't need to do anything else. And what it shows, and what the history shows, is no, actually, that's not true. As that one gentleman touring Europe pointed out, yes, we're being reported in the news, but it's what somebody else chooses to report. It's whatever CNN or Hollywood or whomever decides to put money on and export around the world. I had a professor come up to me at a conference and say he had a similar experience when he was a Fulbright professor in Australia. And the one lady at the department said, you guys have really crappy movies. And she's like, what kind of movies have you seen? And she listed off some of the ones she had seen. He was like, those are horrible. Are those the only ones you get? So a lot of it is dictated by what is exported by the Motion Picture Association, what they feel like spending money to spread around the world. And I saw this kind of living in England. I'm like, they exported that one, but they didn't export this one. What's going on? And so I agree with you. There is this, we need to have this engagement because we need to fill the gap. We need to have a full picture, and people need to be aware that if they need facts on certain issues about the United States, if they want to know the full picture, here's where they can go. And at various points in history, U.S. history, they had that, and it hasn't always been consistent. Does that answer?
Thank you.
And then I just, apropos all of that, I'll never forget Professor Richard Pipes from Harvard, who was President Reagan's first Soviet affairs advisor, he grew up in Warsaw in the 1930s, and when he was an adolescent or a teenager of some kind, he founded an anti-American club. And the reason he did this was he thought Americans were all fools, because he learned about America from Keystone Cops movies and things like that. And it, you know, anyway, let me ask you, do you think, or is there any historical evidence of any U.S. government attempts to work with the private purveyors, say, of movies,
Oh, yeah.
to guide certain ones abroad as opposed to other ones, and how did that work out? What is that history like?
So it was a lot during the World War II, because that was really when Hollywood came into its heyday. The coordinator of Inter-American Affairs did a couple of things with the movie industry prior to the Office of War Information kind of jumping in on the scene. So the CIA under Rockefeller not only set up a kind of a person that sat with the Motion Picture Association and the screenwriters in Hollywood, so they kind of corresponded with one another. They reviewed scripts and they decided which ones would be exported and which ones wouldn't, and why. So they did that. They also paid to have Walt Disney and H.G. Wells travel to Latin America and tour there. And that is where you got Los Amigos from Walt Disney, as well as several other animated features. H.G. Wells ended up producing a film down in Argentina. However, he shipped the entire crew from the United States, which the CIA footed the bill for. So I thought that was interesting because in effect that was listening. So before they created the films that were going to be sent to and aired in Latin America, they sent Walt Disney partially down as like a goodwill engagement thing, but also so that he could gather material that he would use later for films and cartoons that would be distributed in Latin America. What's interesting in terms of films that were not allowed to be distributed was, and this hurts my soul, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington was banned from being distributed because it was deemed to show democracy in a negative light. And if you look up on YouTube, there's a great trailer where a radio broadcaster who has a cameo in the film is saying that this is the best movie of democracy ever made. And I'm just like, this is so, it's so sad. So that, the CIA people thought this really poorly represents the United States. And on the other hand, Hollywood and the people involved thought this is brilliant. This is a great movie to show abroad. And it was banned.
Let me just ask a follow-up then. Do you think that anything like that could be done today?
See, and that was something that I talked about because I was really advocating for greater private public partnerships. And I said that in light of, the government's policy reception overseas more recently, that could be difficult to negotiate, because if you think about it and this was sort of what happened during the Cold War with the Ford Foundation, when it was discovered they had a relationship with the CIA and stuff like that. It was bad for business. It really hurt them. So on the one hand, I think, yes, it's something that needs to be kind of, that tightrope relationship needs to definitely be created, because I think it would be beneficial not only for U.S. public diplomacy. I also think that it would sort of force U.S. to kind of be held accountable, because if you've got a private sector entity that's working overseas, you can't, if there's something you're doing that is not good, it's not going to represent well, they're going to tell you, because it's their face on the line there. So if you think about these prestigious organizations like the Carnegie Endowment or the Rockefeller Foundation that have this long history and very valued image overseas amongst the foreign public, it kind of forces any kind of relationship to be above board and really consider what policies you're going to be advocating overseas. So I think it almost acts as like an audit, sort of, in terms of how far you can take something. So I think it would be beneficial.
Yeah, my name is Jim Rudin, and first I want to say that just about everything I know about public diplomacy, I've learned in this room, first from you and then from a previous speaker. And you used the term cultural engagement twice. And I wanted to ask if within state or these organizations as a whole, there's any institutional body or educational impetus to acquire and instruct cultural knowledge, particularly with regard to various other countries. The reason I ask that, after 9/11, Afghanistan and Iraq, it came to the Bush administration's attention that the Arabs and Muslims had misgivings about us. So Bush appointed a campaign advisor, Karen Hughes, to be his, was that a public diplomacy position?
She was undersecretary.
Undersecretary. She was a disaster. She meant well, but she was absolutely incapable of stepping outside of her American skin. And she went around, and I'm sure she didn't mean to, but all she did was radiate American exceptionalism in the worst term, the worst meaning of that term. And if someone had taken her aside and tried to train her, educate her, maybe she's not trainable, I don't know, but it might not be quite as bad. But is there a body of knowledge, information that's institutionalized with regard to culture in these organizations?
Well, I spoke at the Public Diplomacy Council forum about a month ago, and I was approached by a lady there that used to work in the training office at the State Department, and she said, "We need to have you come speak to the the new foreign service officers and kind of talk about this." I know that in some of the government reports and scholarly literature, there is some concern about how public diplomacy is viewed within the Department of State. And I will preface this by saying I have not worked in the Department of State, so I can't say with any authority. All I know is what people have written in print. So based on that, I would say that, and then also, again, based on what I saw historically, there is a bit of a prejudice towards public diplomacy in generally. And part of that's institutional and how we conceptualize what is diplomacy. So we think of diplomacy as being state to state, and this was something I talked about in my own research, is trying to broaden our conception of diplomacy is not just state to state. One of Ben Franklin's biographers said, Claude Lopez, that Ben Franklin didn't see countries as governments, he saw them as people. So it's kind of, and I don't know if I'm quite answering your question, but I would just say that this has been an issue that's come up in some of the reports, that there needs to be more training for public diplomacy officers and cultural affairs officers. But I would argue, and what I said in my thesis is that it needs to be agency across the agency and not just the Department of State. If you are serving overseas as a member of the U.S. government, you need to be made aware that your actions and what you say reflect the United States. And you will be asked repeatedly, as I was asked as a student at the University of Leeds, what you think about different policies of the United States. Every time I took a cab, it was, so what do you think, did you vote for President Obama? So I think, just being made aware of how their position, no matter how insignificant what their title is, it would be beneficial if there was that awareness that what you say and what you do has an impact and that it's important.
May I comment on this, Katie?
Yeah.
I I worked at the State Department and at the National Security Council on a lot of these issues. And I found a congenital animus against public diplomacy within the State Department. At State, your career is made by demonstrating excellence in relations with governments and not in relations with people. And and insofar as public diplomacy efforts are made, they are seen by many department officers as going over the heads of the government, their clients, to the people, which can oftentimes irritate the governments, especially if we want to maintain, let's say, correct, but relations with the government where we may disapprove of its regime, we may disapprove of its human rights record. There are some problems with it. The department's officers have a big challenge in trying to maintain some kind of stability with that government. And here we are going over the heads of that government to appeal to the people to have warm relations with those people. Those are two separate policies, cool but correct versus, but trying to maintain stability while having warm relations with the people. And so it's a huge problem. There is very little training on these matters. Unfortunately, Ken Moskowitz, who was just sitting here and had to leave, has taught cultural diplomacy, one of the important dimensions of this whole field, at the Foreign Service Institute of the State Department for several years, and is a very experienced officer. And I'm sorry he wasn't here to comment on it, but I found the situation was so bad. And that's one of the main motivations for me starting this school. Because this is, Alexander Solzhenitsyn said, we're here in the company of the former president of Radio Free Europe, okay? And he said, the Voice of America Radio and Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty were the most powerful weapons the United States possessed during the Cold War. He said the power that resides in the airwaves to kindle the human spirit is beyond the scope of the Western imagination. He had it exactly right. The foreign policy establishment of this country doesn't understand this at all. Cannot explain how public diplomacy, how the war of information, the war of ideas, how foreign cultural engagement, foreign engagement with the peoples behind the Iron Curtain helped bring down that Iron Curtain. It's not understood. The historians don't address it adequately, and the professional schools of international affairs don't teach it. And here we have a little fruit of our labors. And I am just delirious with this. I'm just delirious about this. I mean, you cannot imagine how important this is, what you are just witnessing. I mean, there's nothing out there like this. I mean, there are some histories of USIA and some history, but it's a drop in the bucket in the literature. And to have something that's conceptually coherent and persuasive and ultimately a history that's related to fundamental abiding foreign policy issues, this is huge. This is huge what we're witnessing here today.
Where did you get your book published?
Well, so far I haven't found a publisher. I got turned down by 2. They said it was lovely, interesting topic, but haven't found somebody who's willing to take me on their dance card. Harvard said they had a full dance card, so I'm plugging away. Still got more to look at. So hopefully soon, because like I said, this is like tip of the iceberg. Because I think I went from 1776 to 1948. There were 6 cases. I originally had 7. I dropped 1 because I didn't have enough archival information to kind of support what I was doing. And each of the individual cases, I think, really brings out some of these issues more fully. You start to see kind of the connection between diplomacy, foreign relations, and the evolution of what we think of as diplomacy, that concept the way that we think of it today is really a 20th century way of thinking of it, that it's between governments. I would argue that that didn't get solidified until about World War I. And up until that point, if you go back to like de Caleres or Wickfort, some of the first people to write about the practice of diplomacy itself, if you read what they write, a lot of what they say is they're not just interacting with the princes or the court, they're talking about interacting with the people. And this was something that, Ben Franklin very much believed in. And you see it, throughout U.S. history. And I like that a lot of the people who were doing it connected it to U.S. values and principles. Like, this is not antithetical to who we are if we think of it in the way that, our founding fathers thought of it. That it is something we can do, and we're not violating any of our principles.
Can I add something to what both of you just said? 3 weeks ago, I attended a conference here. The Kroc Center at Notre Dame and New York University, D.C. held a 2.5-day conference entitled The Vietnam War, Then and Now, Lessons Learned. And most of the participants and attendees of the conference were former anti-war demonstrators. They're active in the anti-war movement, published books on it, and so forth. And it's a very well organized conference. But one of many things that came out this came from a Vietnamese professor, Dr. Lien Hong Thi Nguyen, who wrote a book called Hanoi's War. She pointed out that Ho employed people's transnational diplomacy, using musicians and entertainers in Hanoi, bringing Pete Seeger and Joan Baez and people like that over, where they found kinship with their Vietnamese brethren, but sending people like Madame Nguyen Thi Ben all over the world or to Paris to represent the National Liberation Front cause, and to use themes like the poor but determined Vietnamese people are trying to throw off the oppressive elite Saigon government, who are also lackeys of U.S. imperialism and so on. But all these things resonated in former colonies in Africa and Asia. And in my view, what Ho's transnational people's diplomacy did, it was one of the most successful psychological warfare operations in the last century. We got psyoped so bad, we don't even know it, in my view. And so that's a counter-example. I mean, that's an example supporting what both of you said, except it was done by the other side.
Yeah.
I mean, we still, to this day, don't know what hit us.
Yeah.
Because the things that were put out then are now embedded in people's minds and in universities and so forth. That's how well they did it.
I think too, to kind of correspond with what Dr. Lanchowski was saying, is it's an overlooked aspect of history. And I discussed this partially in my thesis, is why is this? Because we think of diplomacy as only being between states. Because it is much easier to do archival research in a national archive looking at diplomacy in the easily found section of the foreign ministry or the State Department's records, because it's just there. It's a lot harder to dig through and find, oh, look, they're talking about people. It's a lot harder to find it and know what you're looking for if that's the history you're trying to tell, because we've already decided what this term means here and now, even if maybe beforehand that wasn't so clear. You had a question?
Yes, I agree very much with you when you say that it has to be distributed, across the government, not just the State Department, but everybody who's involved from diplomacy, the agriculture, in commerce, in education, and things like that. And my question is, did you see anything, maybe in the field of commerce or agriculture, any successes in public diplomacy? That's one question. Usually when I ask that question, people say, well, we have McDonald's and we have other things. And what would be the limit? Where is the limit? What do you think that corporation versus people? What is the limit that you can say that public diplomacy becomes effective? When?
So it's actually a really interesting question. So there were two different ways where commerce was effectively public diplomacy. In the one sense, kind of like you described, where you had a company that was afforded an opportunity to break into a market because of public diplomacy, okay, if that makes sense. So if we think of Hollywood kind of became a world monopoly of films, partially because of World War I and then shortly after that. And it was a while before Europe and some of the other parts of the world were able to produce films and export them in the same way that Hollywood was. And you're starting to see some competition with that with Bollywood and Nollywood, and Europe is, the EU is really starting to push their own films and compete with Hollywood. They are trying to do that as an extension of their cultural diplomacy and trying to get their culture out in the film world. The other way where it was manifested less as this is profitable to me was again connected to U.S. missionaries. So when the United States was going to revolt against Britain, a lot of it was due to economic concerns. We wanted to be free to trade with whomever and get a good deal. We just, that's all we wanted. We wanted to be able to practice business freely and trade with everyone. That was a very liberal principle that we liked. And after we successfully gained independence, one of our first trading partners was with the Ottoman Empire, or we were trying to break into the Ottoman Empire. And the interesting thing is that as we started trade relations there, the government there became very interested in our navy, which actually in comparison to other world navies wasn't all that great, but we had one feather in our cap. We had beat the Barbary pirates, which no other European nation had managed to do. So the merchants that had been traveling to Constantinople and Smyrna went back to the U.S. government and said, hey, Constantinople wants us to help them build naval ships and train their navy. And Congress and the Department of State said, that's not really what we do. That's not really our thing. But if you want to do that privately, by all means, go ahead. So that's what they did. You had a couple of private businesses who agreed to help train the Turkish Navy, which did, the next time they were tested, they surrendered. They fled. So even though we tried to train them, it didn't really work. But a lot of times you had merchants who, in order to conduct business, had to build friendly relations because there was a lot of stigma against the United States, or maybe they just didn't know who the U.S. was. So it was about, building an awareness and understanding about the U.S. before they could even do business with another country. So it wasn't necessarily about being profitable. It was about, in order to even begin trade relationship, they needed to engage with people and talk about America in a more broad sense. Does that answer your question?
I think we're just about out of time.
Yeah, one more quick question. Would your historical research and could that suggest that public diplomacy, foreign engagement, however you define it, really can't be successfully conducted out of the State Department? It really needs to be somewhere else, which is why we had a USIA until it was abolished. Would you think that's
So
possible?
one of the conclusions I made is that the problem with separating it out is we've created another bureaucracy. And after 9/11, with the additional bureaucracies that we've created as a result of 9/11, I'm a little concerned about that. Having had to deal with bureaucracy when I was working in the government, not anxious to start that one again. I think I'm torn on that. I think in order for it to make it work inside the Department of State, you need several things. You need a Secretary of State who values and champions public diplomacy entirely and demands everyone at the Department of State needs to jump on board. This is what we do. This is part of who we are. Regardless of where you work, this is what we do. And the only way you're going to do that is if you get somebody who can stay there from administration to administration to kind of institute that institutional culture and you have support from the White House. And that was kind of what I was telling the gentleman before, that I don't think it's fair to leave this all at the Department of State's doorstep. I think it needs to be a coming together of this is what we need to do in the world. And what was interesting historically was the Department of State recognized this at the end of World War II. The world was becoming more democratic, communication systems were improving. We need to engage not just governments, but people. And for whatever reason, it just never went beyond that.
Thank you, Caitlin. Outstanding.